And we are live. Welcome, mystery and thriller fans. I'm your on-air host, Sara DiVello, and I am so excited to introduce to you Joe Pompeo, here to give us the inside scoop on his true crime book, Blood and Ink. Joe, welcome to Mystery and Thriller Mavens. Tell us about this book.
Thanks so much for having me here. I'll try to match your enthusiasm after just trying to get my kids ready for bed and being completely exhausted. But so Blood and Ink. This is it's a wild, roaring 20s mystery about the unsolved murders of two people killed late one night in September 1922 on a lover's lane just outside of New Brunswick, New Jersey. So this is a city in central Jersey, as well as the home of Rutgers University and Johnson and Johnson. And the dead man, was a prominent Episcopal minister named Edward Hall, who had married into this very wealthy and illustrious New Jersey family with ties to the Johnson and Johnson dynasty. And the woman found murdered beside him was Eleanor Mills, who was more of a working class homemaker and also the star soprano in the choir of the Reverend's church, and she was married to the church sexton. So you had this very salacious and very scandalous crime that immediately became front page news and spiraled into really an epic national media spectacle that played out over the course of a perplexing murder investigation that carries on essentially on and off over the course of 4 years. And that brings us to the other arc of Blood and Ink, which is about the creation of the tabloid press in Jazz Age Manhattan, really about the creation of American tabloid culture, and how this bloody circulation war between America's first three tabloid newspapers in the mid-1920s played sort of like a very direct and very pivotal role in forcing the Hall Mills case, as it was known, to its dramatic climax. That's kind of the general overview of the book.
Well, I am so excited to chat with you tonight, Joe, because I am a true crime junkie. And I am especially excited about your book because we have some overlapping characters with Broadway Butterfly and Blood and Ink. So one of your lead characters is Julia Hartman's editor, Philip Payne, and Julia herself makes some appearances. So this was a book of special interest to me. And I was already a true crime junkie, but I am so excited to dive into all the delicious details with you. But first, I just want to welcome everyone. We are broadcasting live to 6 different destinations across Facebook and YouTube. So, hey, mystery, thriller, and true crime loving friends, no matter where you're watching from, you're in the right place. It is the right time. It is Mystery Monday. And because Mondays can be murder, we're going to get your week off to a killer start. So if you've been here before, you know the drill. And if you're new, here's the drill. Every Monday, I give you my hand-picked featured authors, and you get to ask them anything. So Joe Pompeo is also a journalist. Let's talk to him about writing books versus writing for magazines. Let's talk to him about tabloid culture, his research process. We got a lot of things to chat about. Plus, this book has earned absolutely incredible praise. A New York Times editor's pick and best true crime book of 2022. And the paperback, which has a whole new special revelatory postscript, which Joe has written with research that was uncovered through a secret treasure trove of papers from the defendant's private attorney, came to light after he published the hardcover. So we have even more new information that nobody has even seen yet. And that information comes out in the paperback tomorrow. So we have an exclusive sneak peek here. If you have questions for Joe, get them going in the comments. I'll get them right over to him. Randy joining us from YouTube saying, hi, Joe. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks for joining me.
Randy, thank you for joining us as well. So, Joe, let's start talking first about your research. How long did it take you? How did you do it? Where did you start? Give us all the details.
Yeah, so I from conception to publication was really 4 years. The idea came about in the fall of 2018. I got cooking on the proposal process with my agent, which is really where the research began in earnest. A lot of it started with kind of mining the old newspaper archives and then finding whatever archives did exist with relevance to this case, both like the tabloid angle. So, I was looking at, for instance, the archives of the initial tabloid, the original tabloid newspaper publishers, who were Joseph Medill Patterson of the Daily News and William Randolph Hearst, who we all know who he is, of the New York Daily Mirror, which came a little later. And I was also looking at an archive at Rutgers that had a lot of stuff about the Hall Mills case that was derived from the original prosecution records, which still exist in the office in central New Jersey that prosecuted this case in Somerset, New Jersey. I went there. I spent a day in the evidence unit, and there I actually also was able to handle the existing physical evidence from the case. So like I held a pair of broken eyeglasses that the murdered reverend was wearing when he was killed. I held the stockings that the choir singer was wearing. I held, ancient skeleton keys that belonged to the church, the Star Witnesses day calendar, all sorts of stuff that really, just holding it, gave me this wildly chilling and visceral connection to my characters. And then during the process of the researching the proposal, miraculously, that what you just mentioned wasn't the first trove of records that just happened to emerge over the course of this project. The public library in New Brunswick, New Jersey, while I was really hitting the ground running, they obtained all of the original witness statements and depositions and grand jury testimony transcripts that had been kind of thought lost for years. The evidence unit at the prosecutor's office pretty much told me probably was destroyed years ago. We don't have anything like that. Lo and behold, it surfaces. So that was a very rich vein. And then, after I sold the book and kept going, I mean, it was everything from, mining all those primary source documents, obtaining obscure books from the period, old magazine articles, the trade press of the day, like ancient articles in Editor and Publisher and this other publication called The Fourth Estate. I acquired a bunch of old detective magazines from the 1930s that had some great stuff in it. And then, of course, visiting, the historical sites. I actually went to Rutgers University, so I lived in New Brunswick for 4 years, though I'd never heard of this at the time until 2 decades later, really. But I was able to spend time in the mansion where the Reverend and his wife lived, and visited all sorts of sites that were relevant to the story. So I think that's kind of a good overview of the kind of legwork that went into the book.
So Joe, when you I'm trying to picture holding the actual broken eyeglasses of the one victim, the Reverend, holding the stockings of the other victim, knowing that these two human beings were murdered, their lives seized from them, taken from them in the most violent, unimaginable way while they were wearing these clothes, these items. What did that feel like in your body, your brain, your spiritual self, your emotional self? What was that like in that moment to hold those items?
I wasn't expecting it, because I went there knowing that I wanted to see what documents they had. And like I said, I really was trying to see if there was I was looking for the detective notes and witness statement, that sort of firsthand sort of material. And they didn't have any of that, but I had no idea that they still had all of this physical stuff, or that they would just say, they're all in these totes right next door. You can go rifle through whatever you want. So I think that I was just in a state of surprise that I don't know if I fully appreciated what I was holding, but definitely was, like I said, I had really started to get to know these characters. And this is, when you're writing about, your case too, Broadway Butterfly was contemporaneous to the Hall Mills story. And, you cannot hear the characters' voices. You cannot see how they moved. You can see photographs. But you really can't get very close to them in any physical sense. So I think that for me, just holding these various items, it gave me that kind of sense of proximity. And, I think I just tried to appreciate the history. But again, I was just it was so unexpected, and it wasn't like I went there knowing and preparing that I was going to access this stuff. But it's definitely chilling, holding something that someone was murdered in. And again, there's kind of a level of detachment because it happened so long ago. But nonetheless, it was an incredible experience.
Were the items still what happens to blood stains 100 years later? Were they stained? What was
Well, yeah,
that like?
and I should say too that there's actually even more physical evidence that is kind of like the best physical evidence. Famously, the murdered, I should say that the bodies were staged in this very elaborate way. And for instance, the Reverend's, he was wearing a Panama hat that was placed over his face. It's like a famous artifact from the crime, and that I believe is a little bloodstained, and it's encased in a display case along with Eleanor Mills' shoes, and I think some of the love letters. So there actually is some physical evidence that is preserved, and I think there are probably some, evidence of stains. There's also some random, like I held some random miscellaneous handkerchiefs at the crimes that were at the crime scene that maybe had some blood stains on them, but really this stuff is so ancient and so old, and the people that are now the custodians of it, the evidence supervisor for the Somerset County's prosecutor's office, they're not actively looking at this stuff or expecting ever to be able to find anything. They're really just holding it for historical relevance at this point.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't think, since there was never a murder weapon recovered, so even if you found the fingerprint, the blood, I really don't know what sort of forensic evidence you can find that would actually be able to match to something in a case where you really don't have definitive suspects and you don't have a murder weapon. We don't know what happened to the gun or what happened to the knife that slit Eleanor Mills' throat so severely it nearly decapitated her. So I would love to ask that, and I didn't do this as part of my research, but going further, if I have more to do with this story, I think that I would like to talk to some real like forensic experts and just say, like, is there any possible way of finding anything from this evidence that was corrupted very early on, also because at the crime scene the police did such a sort of bumbling job, and there was immediately these throngs of crowds and like murder tourists that were coming and rifling through everything, that the crime scene was pretty much contaminated from the get-go. So I think a very like pretty near sub-zero chance of finding any sort of anything of forensic value, but it is a fascinating question.
Thank you for sharing your research. Now, Joe, can you also share how you first became aware of this case, living in New Jersey, and having no idea about this case, and then how you first became aware of it, and then got fascinated, sucked in, obsessed with it?
Yeah, I was hunting for a story like this. I read I read a lot of historical true crime. I'm not necessarily a true crime sort of person. I have the same interest that everyone does, in the kind of post-serial true crime boom. I watched all the main ones, but really my interest is more in narrative history, and especially like dark, old, crimes of old. And I decided I wanted to do a book like that would also kind of marry that sort of story with my, professional interest covering the media industry. And of course, all these old stories, as yours book does as well, they all have these like great newspaper characters. The newspapers were so involved and kind of became, much more involved in the actual investigations than would maybe pass muster today. So I was actually just like looking for something, and I talked to a woman named Auntie Tucker, who is the head of the communications PhD program at the Columbia Journalism School, which I'd gone to in the mid 2000s, and I'd studied with her. So I came back, this is 10 years later, and I just said, I want to write a book. Where do I find stories like this? And we were just talking, and she just mentioned in passing, she was mentioning all sorts of like old murders, and she mentioned, there was the Hall Mills case in New Brunswick. So my ears pricked up because I'd never heard of it. It was in New Brunswick, where I went to school, where I had lived. And we were talking separately about the 1920s tabloid press and just how like crazy and lurid and outrageous it was. So I left with like kind of an idea that those two threads were the making of a book. And I went from there. My agent agreed, and that was the start of the process.
Well, clearly the process worked. Blood and Ink is a New York Times book review editor's choice, and they rave Blood and Ink as an addictive whodunit and a vivid depiction of a crime that gripped a generation of newspaper readers. The Washington Post agrees, deeming the book, one of 2022's best works of true crime, raving about your ability to retell the whole sordid business with care and authority. And that's not easy. Let's really pause on that. Care and authority, deftly pacing its astonishing developments. I love that your book is being recognized for all of these facets, which you so adroitly capture and portray on the pages. Melissa joining us from Australia via Facebook saying, "Hi, Sarah and Joe. This sounds fascinating." Melissa, thanks for tuning in. Joe, let's talk about that pacing that the Washington Post was talking about. So I noticed as you have kept me up many a night until sometimes 2 and 3 a.m. These dark circles are thanks to Joe Pompeo, everybody. I noticed that every chapter you end with a question, with a hook, with a what will happen next. What can you tell us about your intentionality and your execution on the pacing?
Well, some of it, it's funny you mentioned that because some of it was very blunt. I just, some chapters had a very natural cliffhanger. I just knew that's where it was. Others, I kind of just like forced a question. And that was one of the things that the New York Times Review dinged me for, probably rightfully, because you just need you kind of like need to just keep the reader moving along. But that's one of the things my editor, this is my first book, and I had a really great engaged surgical editor who, really drilled into me keep pulling the reader along. So even if you had to force it a little bit, it was very important to never end a chapter and feel like, the reader can just put the book down. As you said, I wanted them up at 2 a.m. getting the bags under their eyes, but also as being like a braided narrative. There's books I'd read like that. For example, a book I loved in this genre, I don't know if you've had him on the show, but Daniel Stashower, who's a historical true crime writer, who wrote a book called The Beautiful Cigar Girl about the Mary Rogers murder in mid 19th century New York City, which is the murder that inspired Edgar Allan Poe's The Mystery of Marie Roget. So it's a book that, it goes back and forth between sort of the story of Edgar Allan Poe and the story of this murder mystery. And I kind of had a similar frame. And there's lots of books. This is also sort of the Devil in the White City format, going back and forth between H.H. Holmes and his murder castle and the creation of the World's Fair and the Ferris wheel. So I kind of had a structure that did sort of weave back and forth between, the murder story, the investigation, and then, the emergence of the tabloid newspapers and Phil Payne, my tabloid editor character that comes into this. And, kind of just those stories are kind of happening in parallel, and they begin to draw closer and closer together. So that also kind of gave a natural way to sort of, pace the narrative and easily move back and forth between the two in a way that would keep the reader, wanting to move along and know more.
Well, I think that it worked well because it was interesting because some questions I was wondering myself, like, oh my gosh, I have to know. And some things I was like, oh my gosh, I didn't even think of that. Like, now I need to know. So I liked that. I liked ending the chapters with a question, and it did keep me as a reader engaged and continuing to read. Another as you're saying this, as you just said, the book also addressing the creation and the rise of tabloid journalism. And I think it's really interesting because people now today may not know how very intertwined and how close to investigations newspapers were. Newspaper men and having a press room in the criminal courts, in the police headquarters. And then in this, as you can see, as they will read in your book, Philip Payne actually reopening the case effectively, which we don't think of newspaper people, doing, Woodward and Bernstein certainly being, famous, on the front lines, but even more involved. Were you surprised by that? What are your thoughts on all of this?
Well, I think it shows, kind of however outrageous we think the tabloid press is now, right? And usually we think things get more outrageous. I think that there's an argument that the original tabloids were even wilder. And you see some of the earliest elements of this kind of stunt journalism, this kind of like lawless stunt journalism, which I think kind of like fits in with the lawless climate of the Roaring '20s, where there's just, murders everywhere, and prohibition is political crooked political bosses and all of that. But I think we see the effects that this chase for circulation has when you just want to sell newspapers, and you're gonna find how whether it's like comic strips and hokey contests, or whether it's reviving this murder case that the whole country was wrapped by 4 years later. I mean, all three of the the original New York tabloids, which were the Daily News was the first, and then Hearst came in with the New York Daily Mirror a couple of years later, and then there was a third called the New York Evening Graphic. And all three of these, after the Hall Mills case initially fizzled out in late 1922, each of them took a crack at trying to revive it. Phil Payne originally, when he was still at the Daily News as editor, with Julia Hartman, our mutual character from Blood and Ink and Broadway Butterfly, they staged a fake seance to try to get a suspect to possibly confess to the murder, and they were going to reopen the case that way. It didn't work out. The Evening Graphic, when it debuted in 1924, they went back and they were re-interviewing the star witness, which is this eccentric pig farmer known as the Pig Woman, who claimed to have witnessed the murders. And their plan literally was to get a break in the case and reopen it on the front page of their debut launch issue in 1924. And that didn't work out. But finally, when Phil Payne ended up at the New York Daily Mirror after he'd been fired from the News, and then Hearst scooped him up at this rival tabloid, and he wanted to take down the News, he immediately goes back to the Hall Mills case, and he does this 8-month investigative probe that they do kind of dig up these new leads. It's unclear how dubious they were, but with his proximity to the power brokers in Hudson County, New Jersey, which was kind of the seat of the Democratic Party machine, he's able to bring this dossier directly to them and basically say, here's what we found. And he convinces the governor and the attorney general to reopen the case. And they in turn basically say, well, we'll give you all the best scoops along the way. And they kind of were working in this synergistic way, which, to your point, would not be something that would be acceptable today in any way. But so I don't know if it was surprising to me, and I did kind of know going in that there was this really outrageous culture of the early tabloid newspapers. But I do think we see where that these were the pioneers. Phil Payne and his colleagues, they were the pioneers of this type of journalism, which has carried through today and arguably gave us our first tabloid president, who was elevated by the Daily News, which Phil Payne once edited, and the New York Post, which were also in a tabloid war. So I think that that's sort of the through line to me, and the way we see this kind of tabloid culture that was created in the 1920s, the way it still impacts the world we live in today.
So everybody, Joe Pompeo is not only a true crime author. This is actually his first book. He is a journalist. So Joe writes for Vanity Fair. So Joe, as a journalist, how does this land for you? Are you horrified? Are you intrigued? What are your feelings?
No, I love it. I mean, I love I've covered as a media reporter, not so much at Vanity Fair, but some of my previous roles, I covered kind of the end of the tabloid wars in New York City. And I've always just found the tabloids to be a very rich vein filled with all sorts of kind of throwback characters, kind of the closest you get still today to these kind of those old whiskey, and smoke-filled newsrooms in a way. And I also love the British tabloid. The British tabloids are a fascination of mine. I did profile the Daily Mail for Vanity Fair. And I find, as there are a lot of bad things about the tabloid press, and there is a lot of, corrupt behavior, but there's also a mischievousness and kind of just a funness. They're fun. And I do think also a way where they speak to, and especially back then, they were created to speak to a class of newspaper readers that didn't have access to the more highbrow press or the New York Times. And they did give access and reading access, early on to the immigrant classes. So I think that, the tabloids, they are sort of, there's good and bad about them, but I do just find they're filled with great characters and great stories. And you can't just I think my literary agent would say, you look down at them, at your own risk, because they also are influential and they also are crusading, and in some cases do bring about and seek justice. So I think that they're a complex sort of institution that we now see has very much carried over to the web, as kind of print has waned. But I think that the New York Post, there people still love it. The Daily Mail online is a guilty pleasure for many, myself included. And I think that the tabloid press is not something just to be laughed about. It is a important cultural force.
Yeah, it's interesting because in the course of my research, I interviewed Professor Christopher Wilson at Boston College, who studies how police investigation and violence is covered by the media at the turn of the century, and their investigative techniques, investigations, and how police violence. And in interviewing him, I had assumed that as a professor, he would be very highbrow. And that was my bias. That was my, it turns out, incorrect assumption of, a professor has a PhD. He's going to be all about, the highbrow press and the New York Times, and he's going to be dismissive of the tabloids. I could not have been more wrong.
Mm-hmm.
And he very, very frankly said, he said, in some ways, he said, the tabloid press is much more real and much more honest and much more true because they are in on the street with working class people, with the regular people, with us, not up in some ivory tower looking down at the news. They're here on the street amongst us. And he said, he said that in his research and his teaching and in his writing, that's how he thinks of the tabloids. And it completely changed everything that I had ever thought or assumed or thought that I knew. And it was so fascinating. And it made me read the articles in my research and also just read the tabloids in a completely different way, because I think you're right. They are fun, and there is an irreverence and a wink and a nod about them. So I love that. You guys, I want to remind you that this book is not even out yet. So the paperback drops tomorrow and you can pre-order it tonight, which includes a newly uncovered treasure trove of knowledge that Joe discovered after his hardcover had been published. So here is that link to pre-order tonight. And the good folks at Murder by the Book will send it out tomorrow as soon as it is available. So no matter whether you're watching on Facebook or YouTube, grab your copy of Blood and Ink tonight, not only for the fascinating true story of the very much murdered Reverend and his mistress, but also for the treasure trove of research that Joe uncovered after the hardcover was published last year of the wronged wife's lawyer who saved all of his papers, a steamer trunk Joe has shared of papers, handwritten correspondence, telegrams, cables, his notes, his case notes. Joe, you're not even done going through it. Is that right?
I mean, there's if you could picture like 8 banker's boxes, like letter sized banker's boxes that are filled, like overflowing, just each one completely overflowing with documents. That's the volume we're talking about here. And I learned about this trove because the woman who possesses it, it's a woman named Rhonda Pollock. She lives in southwestern New York State, and she had contacted the New Brunswick Public Library, where I had done a lot of research and developed a very close relationship with the archivist and the director there. She had read my book. She had said, I have these records, that Timothy Pfeiffer, that was the personal attorney of Francis Hall, the accused husband slayer. And she said, I've always wanted to do something with them. Would you want them? And they said, absolutely, yes. Kim immediately called me. I said, how do I get in touch with this very generous woman? Because my paperback deadline is coming up. I'd love to see this stuff. So this was in February of this past year. And we were able to push my deadline back a little bit. And in March, I went up to this town of Portville, New York, this kind of, remote hamlet along the Allegheny River, and was able to rifle through these boxes. I spent 2 days up there and also stayed. The reason this woman, came to possess these documents is because she and her husband in 1970, they bought what was the country house of the attorney. His name was Timothy Pfeiffer, and his wife was from Portville, New York. And this was basically their summer house. It's a beautiful kind of like old Victorian mansion. They preserved it very, very beautifully and restored it. And when he sold them the house, when he was showing them the house, he pointed to a enormous steamer trunk in the corner of the woodshed, and he said, "Oh, these are these old documents from a murder case I did in the 1920s. I should take them out and burn them." There was kind of this fraught relationship clearly to this material, but he didn't do that. Luckily, he left them with the house along with various other furniture and books and antiques and things like that. And they became the stewards of these papers, and eventually, here we are now, and they finally have been delivered to the New Brunswick Public Library, and the archivist there is going through them and will eventually catalog them and make them, some of them at least, available to the public, along with those other records I mentioned, the depositions and witness statements and grand jury testimonies that members of the public who are interested enough in the Hall Mills case, they can go and access that stuff by appointment. So I think it's a very, this is the kind of, we rely on people like this who have the ancient trunk to want to do something with it and put it into the public record, so people like you and me have access to it as researchers. So I'm very grateful to Rhonda and to Kim and the New Brunswick Public Library for helping facilitate all of that.
I mean, I think the dream is to discover the ancient trunk. I would sacrifice a pinky finger and maybe other fingers to get my hands on an ancient steamer trunk full of eight bankers boxes. I would even take just one bankers box. I would take a diary, Joe. I'd take anything, an envelope, like just give me something, but 8 bankers boxes. I
will share there was again, the lead character in your book, Julia Hartman, the crusading early pioneering female tabloid reporter, and I found some telegrams of hers, and I will get those to you, because those were among the things I was able to scan. I was able to scan a few hundred pages out of like the thousands overall, but I'll get back to it. I do want to look through the rest of the trove.
Joe, let me ask you this. Clearly, this lawyer had a long and, prosperous career. This was not his first and only case. He didn't do this one case and then retire. But this woman, Rhonda, did not inherit, 50 trunks of 50 cases. Why do you think that this case stuck in this lawyer's craw? Why did he save these 8 bankers boxes full of papers from this one case when he has tried so many other cases but didn't save anything from those?
Well, it's an easy answer, and I should say he was the personal attorney, and he acted in some ways more as like a fixer, a consigliere, or a spokesman. There were there were defense attorneys who, when this eventually went to trial, some high-powered defense attorneys who were involved in the case. They had a whole team. They called them the $1 billion defense. The tabloids did, at least, because they kind of were poking, a little kind of jabbing these rich people who can kind of just afford to defend themselves to such a degree. But I think for any attorney or anyone who was involved in this case, for any of them, this was the biggest case of their career. This was nothing that they could have been involved with, unless one of them was also involved in the Lindbergh case. And in fact, there was one detective who did play a role in the Lindbergh case, and maybe that is his greater claim to fame. And his role in the Hall Mills case was a little smaller, but this was the murder of a crime of the century, a trial of the century, as they call it. I think arguably perhaps the biggest media spectacle trial crime of the 1920s. I think it might have only been forgotten to time because it was eclipsed by the Lindbergh case, which happened just a few years later, and was even bigger because it involved the biggest celebrity in the world at the time, and this horrific, tragic kidnapping and murder of his son. I mean, that kind of became the the case, when we think of New Jersey old true crime cases, it's the Lindbergh baby, and it happened, just about 20 minutes or so from where the Hall Mills case took place. But really, I mean, Timothy Pfeiffer would not have been involved in anything as big and historical and as memorable. And probably, I'm fairly certain that his obituaries, this is the case they would have noted.
Well, clearly it made, it really meant something to him because he saved all of these papers. And now, 100 years later, you get to hold them and read them and really, as you said, get that proximity. And I think that proximity and your ability to balance the, journalistic space with that proximity, has yielded a really beautiful and meaningful book. The Washington Independent review of books calling the book deliciously tawdry, a well-told tale. We have Kate Winkler Dawson raving. Pompeo brilliantly presents one of the most fascinating cases in the annals of true crime. The Hall Mills murder. Pompeo investigates a story that fuses religion, betrayal, greed, and adoration, which offers a complex and tragic portrait of a love story that seemed almost doomed from the start. And I think that's another important thing. I mean, there's so many different aspects to this. Kate Winkler Dawson, not the only one, who is raving. Publishers Weekly awarding you a starred review, calling the book compulsively readable. I completely agree. And Brian Barrow also weighing in, raving about your ability to vividly bring to life all of the color, drama, and intrigue of a century-old murder case that continues to baffle investigators to this day. Y'all, the book is not even out yet. Here again is that link to pre-order, and the good folks at Murder by the Book, our favorite woman-owned independent bookstore, will ship it out to you first thing tomorrow. So here is that link once again, whether you're watching on Facebook or YouTube. Joe, I want to thank you so much for coming on to give us the inside scoop on this book. So y'all, here again is that link, whether you're watching from YouTube or Facebook. Here's that link. Be sure to pre-order and be sure to subscribe to Joe's Substack, because tomorrow, Joe, tell us what you'll be sharing in your Substack.
Well, I know it's not often that you do a second round of excerpts when the paperback comes out, but I am going to put kind of a little adapted excerpt from my new postscript, which is a chapter length, 6,000 word account of how these new documents came to be and what I found in them. I'm going to put a portion of that, kind of like a teaser, in my newsletter tomorrow, which will, tell the story in more detail of how these records, went from this attorney's private steamer trunk into eventually my hands many decades later. And I won't reveal in this, what I found in those boxes. That's something you'll have to book for. But, for those if you're interested enough just in a story of how, even with a century-old crime, new information can turn up sometimes when you least expect it in the most unexpected of places. That's kind of what this story will convey when I publish it tomorrow in my Substack newsletter, which is joepompeo.substack.com. It is a free newsletter. And I also do interview other historical true crime authors like Sara DiVello and others, like Kate Winkler Dawson and David Gran. And I do other, if you're a fan of juicy narrative history or historical true crime, there'll be a lot there for you to eat up.
Fan of juicy historical fiction, historical narrative, and true crime, reporting for duty right here. So here's that link for Joe's Substack, whether you're watching on Facebook or YouTube. Click and subscribe, and also be sure to follow Joe on Twitter and Instagram. Here are those links as well. And of course, after hearing all the delicious details on this book, you're not going to want to miss it. So pre-order again. Here is that link for Blood and Ink. The paperback version drops tomorrow. You're not going to want to miss this one, with that juicy postscript of what Joe found in the ancient steamer trunk. Joe Pompeo, thank you so much for joining us to give us the inside scoop on Blood and Ink. What a pleasure to hear about your research, your writing process, the creation of tabloid journalism, true crime culture, all the good things. Thank you so much for joining us, and happy early pub day.
Thank you so much for having me. And we still have much more to discuss about Julia Hartman and Phil Payne and our overlapping characters that probably no two people in the world have spent more time researching. So it was extra special to come on and chat with you tonight.
Oh, well, I have loved every minute of reading this book and of chatting with you and hosting you tonight. So thank you so much for coming on and dishing all of the hot goss, spilling the tea, as the cool kids say. And y'all, thank you for spending your Mystery Monday with us. I will be back again with you next week. Take very good care. Until then.